I love Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings, but let's face it, there are some things in it that aren't perfect. I'm Dwayne Watson, and this is Catch the Wizard. So, Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings films are some of my favorite films pretty much ever made. Part of this, of course, stems from my love of Tolkien's work, but I really do think that Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh did a great job adapting something that, for a lot of people, was considered to be unadaptable. There had already been several attempts to adapt The Lord of the Rings for the screen, including Ralph Bakshi's 1978 Lord of the Rings, which ran out of money and therefore time and ends right at the very end of the Battle of Helm's Deep, and the 1977 and 1980 TV movies by Rankin and Bass, which are my very first introductions to Middle-earth. And while those earlier ones definitely have a special place in my heart as something that really got me into Tolkien in the first place, Peter Jackson's films actually really elevated the bar in terms of storytelling and in terms of adaptation. However, they do have some issues. There are things about them that I don't particularly like that, depending on my mood, I am more or less forgiving of. It just kind of depends upon how I'm feeling that day. That said, I really do love these films, and I watch them and regularly am moved by them. So I don't want to pretend like I have major problems with these films and here's why they're bad. I love the films. I think they are great. They are not the book, of course, but they do a great job for what they had and for the money they had and for the time that they had to adapt this storyline. But there are a few things that bug me specifically about Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh's adaptation of the book itself. Number 12 on my list is the line,
"Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys."
Now, this is one of those things that when you're watching the movie, at least when I'm watching the movie, and I asked my wife about this too, just to double check, when we're watching the movie, we don't really notice it that much. It's not something that really throws us out of the story. But if you really think about it, this line doesn't make any sense. Especially, it doesn't make any sense for an orc to say. It kind of implies that orcs have restaurants, that they have menus upon which they can order things like meat. And the way that orc society is depicted in these films does not suggest that they have actual written menus. So this is just an example of a small thing that is not really that big a deal, but it does kind of bug me. Number 11 is an example of something that I completely understand why the decision was made to adapt this the way that they did. And that is cutting out the Saruman of many colors. So in the book, when Gandalf goes to Saruman for his help, thinking that he's a good guy, he sees that Saruman is wearing this weird robe that kind of shimmers and has lots of different colors to it. And when Gandalf calls him Saruman the White, he calls himself Saruman of many colors, kind of implying that he is therefore the greatest of all the wizards and taking over their positions and their power and that sort of thing. I can totally understand why they adapted it this way. Having Saruman spin around in a really glittery, shiny robe, I don't know. I get it why they don't do it. On the other hand, it would have been really cool to see. Now, if you want an example of this done poorly, check out the 1978 Ralph Bakshi film, where they do include the Saruman of many colors line and kind of botch the visual aspect of that. Number 10. And this is another one, just like the Saruman of many colors, where I understand why they cut this, and that is cutting out Tom-bom. Now, I love Tom-bom. He's one of my favorite parts of the books, and he's actually one of those things where when you read the book and you start getting into the discussions around Tom-bom as a character, what is he? Who is he? What is his point? Those questions are never answered by the book, but there's lots of little hints that are in there that lead you different places, and there's very interesting ways of dealing with that question of who is Tom-bom. And I think that when you actually see the lines of the scene where Tom-bom actually shows up, you can understand why Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh felt they really had to cut this, and there was no way for them to adapt this particular scene. This is Frodo in Frodo's voice. He turned round and listened, and soon there could be no doubt. Someone was singing a song. A deep, glad voice was singing carelessly and happily, but it was singing nonsense. Hey doll, merry doll, ring-a-dong dillo, ring-a-dong hop along, fall lol willow, Tom-bom jolly Tom, Tom-bombadillo. And then the description of Tom Bombadil kind of, again, solidifies why they cut this character out. There was another burst of song, and then suddenly hopping and dancing along the path there appeared above the reeds an old battered hat with a tall crown and a long blue feather stuck in the band. With another hop and a bound, there came into view a man, or so it seemed. At any rate, he was too large and heavy for a hobbit, if not quite tall enough for one of the big people, though he made noise enough for one, stumping along with great yellow boots on his thick legs and charging through grass and rushes like a cow going down to drink. He had a blue coat and a long brown beard. His eyes were blue and bright, and his face was red as a ripe apple, but creased into 100 wrinkles of laughter. I think you can see from that why Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh really felt they had to cut Tom Bombadil out from the movie. That there just wasn't any way for them to maintain the look and the feel of the movie with this really crazy character. We actually do get a nod to the Old Forest scene in the extended edition of The Lord of the Rings, when Merry and Pippin are almost devoured by a tree while in Fangorn Forest and left alone by a Treebeard. However, I still would really like to, at some point in the future, see the Old Forest, the Barrow Downs, and Tom Bombadil complete with his blue feather and his yellow boots running through the forest and singing. I think that would be really, really cool to see. Number 9 on the list, and this is a relatively short one, is not having Radagast in The Lord of the Rings, but including him later on in The Hobbit. I completely understand, again, why Jackson and Boyens and Walsh decided to cut Radagast from the film. The more characters you add, the more people are going to be asking who is that and why is he important and what's the point of it. And a lot of Radagast's story is actually told by Gandalf in the Council of Elrond chapter in the book. So it's a lot of exposition rather than stuff that you actually are present with in the book. But on the other hand, cutting Radagast makes it seem like Gandalf rushes to see Saruman because Saruman's the only one who can solve the problem, and Gandalf just has to go see Saruman. Whereas in the book, Radagast is carrying a message from Saruman saying, "Hey Gandalf, I need to see you." And that makes Gandalf seem a little bit less desperate and a little bit less like a rube. And that part I think is missing in the movies. I wish that they included something like that, some reason that Gandalf is desperate to go see Saruman rather than just that he doesn't know what to do about the ring. Number 8 is an example of Tolkien's world building that is left out of the Jackson films, and that is the mountain Caradhras being an actual spiritual presence as opposed to just having Saruman giving incantations from the top of Isengard to cause the storm and to cause the rocks to fall and the snow to fall on the Fellowship. This is something that's very ambiguous in the book. It's never actually explained, but basically, if you read that section, the most likely conclusion is that the mountain itself is actually fighting them and forcing them off of the mountain, which again sounds kind of crazy, but I really like the world building there, and that part's missing from the movies. Again, this is an example where, yes, we completely understand why it was cut from the films, but I would have really liked that concept to have been present in the movies. Number 7 is not including the scouring of the Shire in the movies. We get a little bit of a hint of the scouring of the Shire, or at least the events leading up to the scouring of the Shire, in Galadriel's mirror when Frodo sees the Shire being taken over by orcs and Sam and other hobbits being led away in chains. But the scouring of the Shire is a part of the book that a lot of people think is unnecessary, but that I think actually ties everything all together. It helps show the hobbits on their own using the lessons and the skills that they have learned over the course of their long journey to help their own people. And it helps to bring home the War of the Ring to the Shire itself. The Shire was not untouched by the War of the Ring. The Shire was directly affected by it when Saruman leaves Isengard and goes and actually messes with the Shire, and then the returning hobbits have to deal with this problem. It helps to emphasize Frodo's change and the fact that Frodo goes from being very active at the very beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring to not really being able to fight at the end of Return of the King. And it allows Merry, Sam, and Pippin to step up and to actually lead as opposed to being the more of the followers, especially for Merry and Pippin. Of course, Sam has his own leadership moments in Return of the King, but Merry and Pippin mostly follow. They have moments of heroism, very important moments of heroism, but this is their chance to stand on their own without the support of the quote-unquote greater people in Middle Earth, and I think that is missing when you take out the Scouring of the Shire. A lot of people would have complained because they're like, well, the Return of the King already has a ton of different endings before you even get to the very end, but you already have that, and people are already complaining about it, so you may as well include it. Number 6 is an example of something that definitely is a little bit nitpicky, but it's something that I think would have been really cool to see differently, and that is Galadriel having her freak out over the ring when Frodo offers it to her. Now, this is hard because overall I really like Cate Blanchett's portrayal of Galadriel. I think she does such a great job with this character and portraying the age and the majesty and the wonder that she projects onto the non-elvish characters in the book. But her freak out, first of all, I don't like the look of it. I think it looks a little weird. It's one of those examples of an effect that I don't think works as well. And that one I don't think ever really worked great. And the other thing is I kind of like, having rewatched it several times, I really like 1978's Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings, in this particular scene especially.
And I came to test your heart.
And the way that his Galadriel plays with this dialogue differently. That said, I think this is an example where you can really see both examples as having their merits. I just happen to personally prefer the Bakshi version in this particular case, to Galadriel kind of freaking out as the queen, who is both terrible and beautiful. Number 5 on my list is Aragorn's death fake out in The Two Towers. This is one of those things where occasionally, and we're going to talk more about one scene that's more important, I think, later on, but this is an example where Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh add a scene. They add a lot of scenes, actually. They add a lot of stuff to this section of The Two Towers. They are adding so much stuff in a series of movies where they already have too much material to adapt. So this is an example where, okay, so you cut Bombadil, right, for time. You cut Radagast for time. You cut all these other things for time. And in this particular instance, you're adding extra stuff to the movie that isn't in the book, and I don't think adds anything to what's going on. Now, what it's there for, I completely understand. This is an example where, again, I'm not saying that I think this is like messes up the movie or I don't understand why they did it. I understand why they did it. They felt like they needed another moment of a character maybe being dead and then coming back. What this ends up looking like is just a lesser version of the Gandalf scene in Moria. You already have Gandalf doing that thing way back in Moria. You don't need to have it happen to Aragorn also. And then later on, of course, in Return of the King, you're going to have the Frodo being stung by Shelob, and that whole is he dead, is he alive kind of thing, which of course in the books is actually something that takes place in the Two Towers, and that's where it ends. And so at the end of the Two Towers, you're actually wondering, is Frodo still alive? With the Aragorn death fake out, it's like not even very long. It's between the time that Aragorn falls over the cliff and the time that you come back to him before you realize that he's still alive and everything's perfectly fine. So I really don't think it's necessary, and it's just an extra bunch of stuff that they added to the movie. And that part, it kind of bothers me for that. Related to that one, and this is just a sub point under number 5, is I don't like the way the wargs look. I like the way they look in The Hobbit better, and I do appreciate the fact that The Hobbit kind of fixed the look of the wargs in the world of the Jackson films. So numbers 4 to 1 are things that I actually really don't like about the Lord of the Rings. The previous numbers are all things that I think are kind of dumb, or I kind of don't like the fact that they had to make certain choices, but I can understand why they made them. These are ones where I do not like the choices. I do not think they should have been there, and I think the movies would be so much better without these choices. So these are actually things that bother me about the Lord of the Rings. to preface that, I do want to remind people that I still really love these movies and they never ruin the movie for me. But if anything were going to ruin the movie for me, these 4 things would be the closest. In order of least annoying to most annoying, then we're going to start with number 4, the wings on the Balrog. Now, this is one of those things that is argued about by Tolkien fans over and over again. But if you look at the text, there really is only one way to properly read this section. And that is something that I don't think you can really argue against unless you decide to ignore certain aspects of grammar and language, which seems kind of weird with The Lord of the Rings because it's all about Tolkien and the language and the words, and none of this is accidental on his part. He didn't accidentally happen to word things a certain way, and that's why people are confused. This is worded very specifically. Balrogs don't have wings. The wings on the Balrog are metaphorical. In the scene in the book, it says, the shadow about it reached out like 2 vast wings. So there is a shadow, and the shadow is spreading out from the Balrog like wings would spread out if the Balrog had wings, but the Balrog doesn't have wings, so it really is just a shadow. And 2 paragraphs later, Tolkien uses this particular line here. It says, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. These wings don't go from being a simile in 1 paragraph and then 2 paragraphs later to being literal wings. They're still metaphorical or figurative wings. It's the shadow of the beast or of the creature that you're seeing there. There are practical reasons for why you can tell that Balrogs don't have wings. One is the Balrog never uses them to fly. Now, some people would say, what about penguins, for example, or ostriches? There are all sorts of things that have wings that don't fly. Okay, maybe. But if you go back to the Silmarillion, so this is where we have to get really nerdy with it, there is a hidden kingdom that Morgoth can't get to, the big bad from the Silmarillion. He can't get to it. He has these Balrogs have been with him since way back in the beginning. They're some of the very first spirits that followed him. There's these spirits of fire, the Balrogs. And they run along the ground. You never see them fly. They're not animals that evolved. They are spiritual creatures that have the ability to incarnate themselves into bodies, and that's what they are. So they wouldn't give themselves, I don't think, they would give themselves fake wings and then be unable to fly. And then when Morgoth actually creates dragons with wings, that's like a big upgrade to the dragons because now he has flying creatures that he can use. So again, I have a problem with the whole thing, the idea that the Balrogs have wings when they could have been using them all this time and they haven't ever used them in the books before, and they don't use them the Balrog doesn't use it in this particular scene in Moria. He doesn't fly up and out of the chasm, he falls. It seems a little bit weird to me. These last 3, my biggest problem is trying to figure out what order to put them in. Because these are the biggest 3, the big things that really bother me about Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings films, and that every now and then when I'm watching them, if I'm not in the right frame of mind, I get annoyed by them especially and want to talk about them. So these are not really in particular order. This is the order that they're bothering me right now. Ask me in 6 months and I might tell you something completely different as far as the order goes. But number 3 is Faramir. This is one of those things where I love Faramir in the book. I think he is one of the greatest characters that Tolkien ever wrote. And his contrast to Boromir is very, very important. So what Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh do with Faramir is bring him down closer to Boromir's level. And that I don't like. Eventually Faramir comes around. Eventually he lets Frodo and Sam go. But this is another example where you have movies that are having to cut a lot of things from a book. A lot of things are cut from the book. And you add a very long section where Faramir decides he's going to take Frodo and Sam to Denethor, just like Denethor wants. He's going to take the ring with him. He takes him. Frodo and Sam are constantly trying to say, hey, this is a bad idea. But Faramir persists. They get all the way to Osgiliath. And then they're attacked at Osgiliath. And then eventually Faramir comes around and says, okay, I'll let you go. He does eventually come back around to where he's supposed to be in the book. He does stand as a contrast to his brother Boromir, but it takes you a while to get there. This is something that happens a fair amount in the adaptation, and especially you can see it with Aragorn, where they like to bring characters down several pegs in order to make them maybe more relatable. I happen to think the whole relatability argument is kind of a bad argument. That's something that I'd have to make an entirely new video on, and I don't want to get into it right now. But I really do think that Faramir is a better character in the book. I like Faramir better in the book. He still has issues with Denethor. The issues are still there. He still decides to ride out with very few men and try and retake Osgiliath under impossible odds in order to please his father. That is still there in the character. You don't have to add extra scenes in order to get there. And this is really something that I think they should have done away with in the film, and they should have just adapted this character straight as he is in the book and not changed anything. These next two, I really am still struggling, even right now in the middle of recording the video, with which one is number 1 and which one is number 2. For right now, I'm going to go ahead and say that number 2 is stupid Treebeard. Having Treebeard be unable to make a decision about Saruman and eventually deciding, oh, well, we can't do anything about Saruman. This isn't our fight. We're going to weather the storm like we always have. We're just not going to take a part. I think that is ridiculous, and it is one of the dumbest things that people have done in an adaptation maybe ever. I am being hyperbolic on purpose, but it is one of those things that I really, really do not like. It is, I think, worse than the Faramir change, because Faramir eventually comes around on his own, and he remains fundamentally kind of still the same person. His reason for attempting to bring Frodo and Sam to Denethor is not really because of the ring. It's because of his devotion to his father. That is still present in the character in the book. Stupid Treebeard is not the character that is in this book. Treebeard in the book, his problem at the Entmoot is not that he thinks, what do we do? He knows what to do about Saruman. The problem is he has to bring in the other Ents who have not directly experienced Saruman's evil for themselves. Treebeard knows Saruman is evil. He knows he's completely fallen. He knows that he is not the wizard that he used to be, and he knows that he has to be dealt with. His task is not deciding on his own whether he should be involved. His task is, how can I convince the other Ents that have come from a long way away and don't see Saruman ever? How can I convince them that this is their fight? I understand again why you might want Merry and Pippin to be more involved in convincing the Ents. I understand that impulse. I just think it's a bad decision. And the reason why I think it's bad is not because I think that you shouldn't bring Merry and Pippin up. I think it's bad because you ruin Treebeard by trying to bring Merry and Pippin up. This is an example, by the way, of where if you kept the Scouring of the Shire, you wouldn't need to bring Merry and Pippin up, because Merry and Pippin would have their heroic moments at the end of the book. And finally, our number 1 thing that has been bothering me about the Jackson, Boyens, and Walsh The Lord of the Rings films after having just watched it for New Year's Eve, and that is this: the breaking of Gandalf's staff by the Witch King. This is something that's only in the extended edition. I double checked this to make sure, because I thought, I wonder if how does this play out in the theatrical version? And I watched the theatrical version, and the breaking of Gandalf's staff is not in the theatrical version. Instead, Gandalf has his staff. Pippin comes and gets him. There is a moment where the Rohirrim show up. You see Gandalf arrive at the crypts where Denethor is preparing the pyre for himself and for Faramir. He grabs a spear from one of the guards, and then that's what he uses when he attacks Denethor. And I guess if you're watching the theatrical version the first time, the question may come up is, why does Gandalf not use his own staff at this point? Well, the reason he doesn't use his staff is because in the extended edition, he has broken his staff. His staff has actually been broken. Now, why is this a problem, especially in the extended edition? It is a problem because earlier in the extended edition, Gandalf broke Saruman's staff. He says, Saruman, your staff is broken, and Saruman's staff splinters into pieces, and it is a visual and very kinetic representation of Saruman's loss of authority and his loss of power and how far Saruman has fallen. It is a powerful scene. So then, when you have the Witch King confront Gandalf in Minas Tirith and arrive on the walls of Minas Tirith, or right inside of Minas Tirith, and confronted by Gandalf and Gandalf attempts to drive him away, the Witch King draws out his sword and it bursts into flames. And this happens in the book just like that. He draws the sword, it bursts into flames, and in the book, right when that happens, the Rohirrim's horns are sounded and the Witch King leaves, because now he has a new enemy to go fight. And in the extended edition of the films, instead, he pulls out that sword, it bursts into flames, and Gandalf's staff breaks. The problem with this scene is, what does this mean? If you have Gandalf's staff break here, does that mean that Gandalf has lost power? Does that mean that Gandalf's authority as Gandalf the White is suddenly now taken away also by the Witch King? It doesn't make any sense. The visual metaphor that you had of Saruman's staff breaking and the visual metaphor of Gandalf's staff breaking are just completely incongruous. They don't make any sense. And I really think this is an example where they added another thing. This is something that I touched on in the Black Riders and Bree video. And that is that Jackson and Boyens and Walsh tend to up the danger of the Nazgul in the movies in ways that I actually think is kind of harmful to the overall themes. And in this particular example, the Witch King breaking Gandalf's staff is something that should never have been able to happen. It doesn't make any sense. It's just a really bad choice. Those are my 12 things that kind of bug me about the Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings films. If you have anything that you want to add to the list, things that you think are kind of a bad choice, or if you disagree with something that I said, please leave a comment down below. And if you like this, please click like and subscribe. And if you would, share it with other people that you think might enjoy it. I'm Dwayne Watson, and this has been Catch the Wizard.